Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming to this morning's lecture. I can see quite a few faces here, familiar faces for this week's activities. We are very fortunate to have a feast of lectures this week from distinguished speakers all around different parts of the world, giving lectures on the theme of science, technology, and society, as I mentioned. And we're very pleased this morning to have with us as our distinguished speaker, Professor Sergio Sismondo. Professor Sismondo is Professor of Philosophy and Sociology at Queen's University, Canada. In addition to his philosophical research, he's also done a lot more work now in the area of empirical, sociological, political, and cultural research. And one of the projects is actually on how pharmaceutical companies attempt to establish control over particular domains of medical knowledge through the efforts on everything from clinical trials to medical education. Summing up much of this research is a book that is published for a non-specialist audience called GhostManaged Medicine, Big Pharma's Invisible Hands. Very attractive title for the layman. Professor Sismondo's other work spans the field of science and technology studies. He's the author of An Introduction to Science and Technology Studies, and also the editor of the journal Social Studies of Science. Without further ado, let me invite Professor Sismondo to give us the lecture.
Thank you very much. Is this a good volume? People can hear well, and that's good for you? Good. Thank you very much for the generous introduction, but also for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. I mean, I think that it's to be given the opportunity to give a presentation. I'm going to be presenting a piece of work that is actually in that book, but I'm going to be trying to connect it to some broader themes, and so I'll be advertising the book along the way, but I hope to be talking about some very general issues in science and technology studies. So let me start with a quote from a person who was then CEO of Pfizer, Hank McKinnell. We call it a Salesforce, talking about the Pfizer Salesforce, but our Salesforce doesn't sell, it transmits knowledge. And to a large extent, I'm actually going to agree with McKinnell. I think that there's a real truth to what he has to say here. At the same time, I don't think that means that the Salesforce doesn't sell. I mean, the Salesforce sells via knowledge. And I think that we can think about interesting ways in which the knowledge works here. I'm going to be presenting a somewhat ugly picture. This is not a picture of a kind of, I call it a pathological picture of the construction and distribution of knowledge. But I think it's nonetheless a kind of exemplar of this kind of thing that I'm calling a political economy of knowledge. So we're often told that we live and work in a knowledge economy, by which we mean usually a knowledge-based economy. But however, that kind of economy sort of draws attention to knowledge as a sort of good in and of itself. Knowledge becomes something that is a quasi-good anyway. Talking in terms of political economies of knowledge, I think draws attention to, allows us to talk about circumstances of production, distribution, and consumption of knowledge, adopting some of the classic categories from 19th century political economy. So I'm going to be talking about primarily something that lies right in the middle of sort of the production and the distribution of pharmaceutical knowledge. I'll start with production. I think one of my assumptions here is a familiar one to those in science and technology studies, which is, it's the obvious. It takes work to create knowledge. It never moves by itself. And institutions don't automatically take it up. So that's another way of seeing the project of political economies of knowledge, is that these are all material activities, sort of producing, distributing, or circulating, and taking up knowledge. So let me start with a little bit on the production. And I want to start with a puzzle. This is a well-known phenomenon. Journal articles that have been sponsored by the pharmaceutical industry have a very high chance of reporting results that are favorable to the sponsors. On some measures, they have a risk factor of approximately 3 of producing knowledge that is favorable to the sponsors. I was engaged in a meta-analysis. We ended up with a lower risk ratio, but still, it was kind of interesting. So this is a meta-analysis of approximately 4,000 articles, 4,000 studies, and we found a very, very consistent picture that the pharmaceutical sponsored knowledge is going to end up favorable to the industry. And so the puzzle is, how does this happen? Here's a standard, what I think of as a standard image of sponsored research. So we have a researcher who goes out and says, I'd like to perform a study, and proposes it to a drug company. The drug company then pays for it for whatever reason. This might be to gain goodwill. It might be because the drug company is interested in the results. It doesn't really matter. And then the researcher goes, performs the study, writes, does the analysis, writes it up, and publishes it. And that's the standard image. It's hard for me to understand how the kind of bias that we see in, say, that meta-analysis that I was presenting a few minutes ago could happen on this model, on the standard image of sponsored research. But we have to think, how does the researcher align their interests with the funder's interests? So there might be through design. We can see sort of where that is, bias through comparators. You can choose particular comparators, different dosages of drugs or something like that, where you're more or less likely to come up with one result rather than another, through experimental populations, choice of outcomes to measure, and so on and so forth. It could be by aligning interests through the implementation. A classic one is abandoning some sites where the study seems to be going wrong, right? You have a multi-site study, and you start saying, oh, well, something weird is going on in this site, and so we abandon that one, and lo and behold, we end up with a more positive result, or interpretation or publication. But I wonder, I know researchers, I know medical researchers. Is the conflict of interest of having funding for a study really strong enough to produce these kinds of consistent results? I'm a big believer in conflict of interest in the sense that I believe that it has enormous power, but I'm not sure that it has this much power. Luckily, I don't need to think that conflict of interest has that much power in order to understand the results. And that's because a somewhat lesser known phenomenon is the existence of contract research organizations and the size of contract research organizations. It turns out that of industry-sponsored research, approximately 70 to 75% is actually run through these contract research organizations, which do research for hire. And they produce the data and hand it over to the drug companies. They have no interest in the independent publication of it. And so now we can understand this conflict of interest in a different term. Maybe industry acts in its own interests. And that, I think, is pretty obvious. I mean, I think we know that the industry does. So the standard image of sponsored research becomes something like this now, because we don't have the researcher proposing this, sort of developing and proposing the study. We don't have the researcher approaching the company, because 70 to 75% of the research is actually being initiated by the company and farmed out to these contract research organizations. So all we're left with is the researcher writes the article and submits it to the journal. Because drug companies don't author articles, neither do contract research organizations author articles. Instead, the articles that appear in medical journals are almost always authored by medical researchers, the sort of people who work at NTU in the medical school or at my home university. Again, people we know. So I think we're now reduced for the standard kind of sponsored research. This is what it has to look like. Or is it? Here's a quote, it's old, from 2003 by Dr. Jeffrey Liss. Liss was the principal investigator on this study, which was a study of Vioxx. You might remember that old drug that got withdrawn in 2004. In the United States. And he writes, he said to a journalist, Merck designed the trial, paid for the trial, ran the trial. Merck came to me after the study was completed and said, we want your help to work on the paper. The initial paper was written at Merck, and then it was sent to me for editing. So maybe even that last bullet point in the standard image, there's something wrong with that. When I started seeing material like this now quite a while ago, about a dozen years ago, I got interested in what I call the ghost management of medical research, but which turns out to be called publication planning in the industry. And so I started studying this kind of work. It actually is an illustration of how science and technology studies helps you to think differently about this sort of thing. Ghostwriting was, when I started doing this research, a recognized phenomenon within the medical world. People were concerned about ghostwriting, they were sort of drew attention to it, and so. But the kind of presentation that one would see in medical journals of complaints about possible ghostwriting or something like that treated it both as very common, but always as one-off, as a one-off kind of activity. And when I started, when I got interested in this topic, I became immediately interested in who does the writing? How is this funded? How is this organized? What kinds of institutions are involved? What are the structures that shape this? And that turned out to be a very, very productive approach to this particular topic, because as soon as I discovered that there was a sub-industry within the pharmaceutical industry that's called publication planning, I could do things like go to the meetings of publication planners. And so a lot of the data that I'm going to be presenting actually descends from my attending conferences and workshops for and by publication planners. So, and I or research associates have been to a number from as early as 2007 and as recently as 2017. The last one was really just to check that nothing has changed, I have to say, but that's, anyway. So, ghost management, I define it here when drug or device companies, but I'm not going to talk about medical device companies at all, or their agents control or shape multiple steps in the production and distribution of research analysis, writing, and publication of articles. Pharmaceutical companies treat data as a very valuable resource, and it is something to be deployed strategically, carefully, and developed, managed, and deployed. It starts with typically a publication planning document. Ideally, from the company's point of view, the publication planning document would be drafted before the studies are fully designed. So the publication planning document would be already imagining publications that would be going out in advance of there being data. In practice, it rarely happens that way. That's the ideal. The publication planning document usually comes after a number of studies are underway and probably completed. The publication planning document describes a number of different things that happen along the way. There's no real need to read this or anything like that. This is just an illustration of a kind of timeline of a march toward the launch of the drug and different kinds of activities that will happen along the way. And it imagines a certain number of publications. Here's a different view. This is redrawn from a slide that was presented at a publication planning document. I have the original paper, but so it imagines different kinds of publications along the way that will be placed in different kinds of journals for different kinds of audiences. As you'll see from this slide, this is for an imagined fairly almost a blockbuster drug. This is imagined for a very large drug, and with sales. Blockbuster in the industry is typically these days defined as a drug with sales more than $1 billion US. So this is the sort of image that is going to happen of the publications up to and following the launch. This is often arranged around a launch, sometimes arranged around a need to solve a problem for a drug that has been around for a while. So you might have another up-ramping of publications a few years later if there's some sort of issue to be dealt with. And as you'll see from the numbers here, this is roughly 100 publications around this one thing. These are medical journal publications. That's not an atypical number. For a blockbuster drug, this would be a very, very typical target figure, sort of in the range of 100 publications in the 5 years, sort of immediately preceding and following launch. For some kinds of products, that's much smaller numbers. Vaccines, for example, have a different sort of market structure. You don't need to convince lots of individual doctors to prescribe to provide vaccines. You can convince public health authorities, governments, and so then you have a much smaller number of publications, and they're much better targeted towards specific readerships that are going to have the authority to buy very, very large numbers of the documents. Let me follow one article here. Again, this is an old case. To some extent, for the concrete details, I have to rely on court cases. And so this is from a court case around hormone replacement therapy. And so this is from the 2003 publication plan for Wyeth, Achieving Clarity, Renewing Confidence. And this is the Achieving Clarity, Renewing Confidence is because of the WHI study in 2002 that found an increased risk of breast cancer and heart disease in women who were taking hormone replacement therapies. So the confidence had to be renewed in these products. So I chose a sample publication from this plan, and then I followed it through the court documents thereafter. So here's the birth of this publication. Jean Wright of Parthenon Publishing in the UK writes, please find attached the first draft of PC2. Of course, this is a corporation, so everything has to have a label. This is PC2, it's going to be the second publication around in the PC series. And the title is A 2-Year Comparison of the Effects of Continuous Combined Regimens of 1 milligram, et cetera, in postmenopausal women for initial review. That's the Jean Wright writing there. Now, right at the top of the page of the actual manuscript, sort of in the middle of the top of the page, is author to be determined. Okay, I'm going to cut a long story somewhat short here and skip 7 months later, the March 4th, 2003 tracking report, of course. These are companies, everything has to be tracked. Gives us a timeline. First draft submitted for initial review August 11th. That was actually wrong on the tracking report. I can prove that in the court documents. It was a little bit later. It was whatever I said last time, August 18th. Comments received from Daniela, December 7th. That's Daniela Spielman. She works for Wyeth. Revised draft submitted January 3rd. Comments received from Sophie, February 5th. That's Sophie Olivier, also works for Wyeth. Revised draft submitted to Gary. That's Gary lost his last name, February 28th. Comments received from Richie. That's Richie Liu. February 28th, I hope Richie was sort of giving comments on the next draft as opposed to on the previous one and being late. Anyway, again, a Wyeth, all of these commenters are Wyeth employees. And as you can see, the draft has been revised now twice. So this has gone through 3 different versions, and that's pretty good for an article that still has no author. On April 2nd, a month later, 3 authors appear on the tracking report. Bouchard P, Addo S, and Spielman D. That's the Spielman is the Wyeth employee. The other 2 are independent academics. And then I really love this. On the tracking report, it says need to contact, as if P. Bouchard and S. Addo haven't yet been notified that they're going to be authors on this publication. Skipping forward again, September 2003, the 2004, I apologize, changed author list. And I got confused because I thought maybe I lost track of PC2 because there was also a PS2, there were other things that I thought maybe did I make a mistake? There are now 5 authors, what happened to the others? But no, in the documents I find here, Spielman writes, the 2 Italian authors agree with the paper and replace Addo, who went over to our competitors, right? And Jean Wright, the person originally handling this manuscript, says, please note that S. Addo has been deleted from the author list for PC2. Daniela was doubtful whether she should be included because she now has connections with Organon, the said competitor. In all of this, there's no indication whatsoever that the external authors made any input. On August 26th, for example, Wright had completed the draft that Wyeth eventually signed off on and mentioned only that she had dealt with queries by Brenda Rice, yet another Wyeth employee. So in none of the tracking reports is there any indication that any of the academic authors ever played a role. Okay, I told you about I went to conferences. The first one I went to was the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals. It has over 1,000 members. The conference the first one I attended had already 400 participants. I went to the meeting in Philadelphia, and it was preceded by a day of workshops, Publication Planning 101/201 for new publication planners. And I thought, well, I was a new publication planner, so I signed up for the workshops just to find out what this thing was all about. 101 seemed to really fit me. This is a large enough field that there's actually a competitor organization, the International Publication Planning Association. There's sort of a reason for the competitors. The first one is more agency-dominated. Agencies are the firms that work for the pharmaceutical companies to do this sort of work, like the Parthenon Publishing, for example, that I was talking about before. This one, called TIPA, the International Publication Planning Association, is more industry-dominated. So this tends to more represent the publication planners who work within the industry. Nonetheless, the formats of the conferences are very similar. There's overlapping membership. You see actually very, very similar presentations at the two things. This is a little bit less formal. It's a little more clubby than the other one, but very, very similar. So let me just show you a few things that I saw in these at these conferences. Here's somebody, Planner SE here, talking about the importance of publication plans. She's holding an imaginary document in her hand, and she's waving it around. And she said, "What is this? They're promoting the competitor." Well, you left it to the investigators, right? If you leave things to the investigators, that's code names for the author, the eventual authors, right? If you leave things to the authors, then they might end up promoting the competitors. Or here, a planner, EF, says, the approach of having an industry-authored first draft is a good one. Sort of directly responding to this first comment here. Planners recognize that they sit in between, or they see themselves as sitting in between marketing and science. At Publication Planning 101, I was taught that we really do like to stress that the publication planning company is not an advertising agency, it's not a PR, that is public relations agency, even though it might look like one. So this is Planner MH talking about this. They're concerned, publication planners are often very concerned about constraining the influence of marketers, as a matter of fact, because they say marketers would do a really bad job of marketing, in the sense that marketers would try to take the claims and make whatever is the most extravagant version of the claim that could possibly be made, using whatever is the most extravagant language that could possibly be made. Publication planners know that if they're going to operate via the scientific literature, they can't do that. They have to tone it down. They have to do the work of marketing via more subtle techniques. So that was Planner MH. But then a few minutes later, Planner MH says, but how are we going to create publications that have the right message and a memorable message for prescribers, right? Prescribers are, in the end, the primary targets of these publications. The publications get taken around to prescribers, that's your doctor, taken to prescribers by sales representatives who will use them to buttress claims that can be made, or they'll be taken by what are known as key opinion leaders who might be giving talks at, say, clinics or after dinner talks or something like that. And these publications become the bases of presentations by key opinion leaders. Here's a company planner talking about the development of, this is sort of not through a publication plan document, but so this guy says, at the beginning of the year, we kind of have a scientific strategy for every product saying, these are the key messages we're hoping to get. And then we look through the data, we'll look at all the upper points that the upper management folks would like to try to see if we have the data to address, and then we'll go through it point by point and try to see. So this is another approach to publication planning. So where you work from the other direction, you have the data already, you try to figure out what kinds of publications you can construct out of this data. The publications are, by and large, ghostwritten. So here's an email from a pharma company to a prospective author. Don't worry, you won't have to write a thing. Because a ghostwriter will do this for you, for us and you kind of give your good name for this publication. Now, actually, I should say that this email was put up on a slide at a publication planning conference as a warning, do not write this sort of thing. This is an actual email that was accidentally publicized. What happened was, in this particular case, kind of a just amusing story. They were desperately trying to do some last-minute revisions around a publication, and the physician who was the lead author on the publication was not available, was traveling was not available, and the company was trying to get in touch with him, couldn't get in touch with him, and went to his wife and said, can you please look through the computer to find this thing? And lo and behold, she found this, and she thought this was really, really odd and publicized it. And so anyway, but this was exactly what one shouldn't write, said the publication planners, even though it was what somebody had written. But it's not technically ghostwriting, because medical journals have criteria for ghostwriting. They have criteria for or they have the reverse. They have criteria for authorship. And publication planners do their best to try to make sure that the authors and only the authors meet the criteria for authorship, or at least meet some kind of stretched version of the criteria, something where it can be plausibly claimed that the authors and only the authors met the criteria for authorship. And so here's a planner saying, the criteria, the authorship contribution criteria is burned on my head, right? And medical journals they're fairly standardized in terms of this sort of thing. They have templates for contribution criteria that are more or less similar across many medical journals, and they have changed their criteria somewhat recently. About 5 years ago, they added an important one that made publication planners' lives somewhat difficult, sort of requiring that authors have responsibility for the entire manuscript. So that's a problem. So publication planners have to do work to get the authors to make contributions. Because if the authors don't make some sort of contributions, then they're not going to meet the criteria. So here is, and this is good pedagogical advice, don't just say, here's a first draft and can I have your comment, says planner CB. She says, say, here's a first draft, and I've tried to figure out the methodology to fit it in the word requirement. However, I feel, could you pay some attention to this? And have I picked up on the right point? In the end, she's directing the authors to make very specific criteria she's identifying places where the authors can add their personal stamp on the manuscript, so that they will then qualify as authors for the publications. Here's another different kind of example of sort of how you get to large numbers. Another planner says, sort of, involving folks early works. The sooner you involve them before you have the data available, the easier it is. Much easier. You go from having one manuscript to having 8 from a pivotal program, right? So you try to multiply manuscripts. This is important if you're going to be if you're marketing via the scientific literature, you want to be producing as many manuscripts as possible, probably, almost certainly. This diagram, I know it's unreadable. The point is not for you to read it, but for you to see the density of it. This is my reconstruction on the basis of attending multiple publication planning conferences of what the ideal process would look like. So the ideal process, you start with a publications team that involves representatives of all of these different departments from pharmaceutical companies. They produce and agency people. They produce a publication plan. Then you parcel that out into manuscript teams. Manuscript teams have, again, they have different departments represented, including the communications agency, and then authors are also considered part of the manuscript team. And then the agency team will have, again, a certain number of people involved in there, and eventually you go to manuscript review and finalization, which is primarily the drug company internal to the company, and you again have representatives of different departments, and so on and so forth, and that produces a manuscript. Multiply this by 100, and you have some sense of the scale of what's going on. Of course, in a publication plan, the people are going to be duplicated, right? I'm not saying multiply it by 100 in the sense that you're going to get 100 times this many people, but this is an idealization. This is what they would like to see happen, not what actually happens. In fact, as we see from the Wyeth document that I presented, a lot fewer people get involved, and they're wearing different hats, and so that's, yep. What about the journals? Well, journal editors are always invited to these publication planning conferences. They attend, they give presentations, they're paid speakers at the conferences. And they make presentations that make it fairly aware that they know what's going on, but without ever saying it. So for example, here's an editor of a major medical journal advertising his journal, right? Why is he advertising his journal? He's speaking to 400 people who are controlling more manuscripts than anybody else. So pulling some of those manuscripts to his journal is valuable, especially since pharmaceutical publications tend to be cited more often. The pharmaceutical company-sponsored publications tend to be cited more often and are more likely to be reported in the news media than non-pharmaceutical industry-sponsored publications. The citation thing is an interesting puzzle in and of itself, and I've tried to think about that. I have some partial solutions to the question about why these things are cited so much more, but anyway, I won't go into that. Or here we have another editor, but she's speaking as a member of the Council of Science Editors here, and she says, we appreciate medical writing as editors because we have to read a lot of papers, and we can tell which ones have had expert writers participate in their development. So she's kind of encouraging the activity, recognizing what's going on. Almost to a T, every single one of the editors who gets invited to these conferences also says, but we don't want to see any ghostwriting. They say, you need to respect authorship criteria. We want to work with you, but we can't have anything that violates the rules. So they have what I think of as a kind of transactional view of publications, where it doesn't really matter who's producing them or anything like that, as long as the rules. Oh, they also give really simplistic versions of the scientific method. They're telling these audiences what the scientific method is. It sort of seems silly. These audiences are extremely sophisticated people. Many of them have degrees in the science, have higher degrees in the one or another biological science. These are not fools, but the editors sort of tell them, okay, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and it sort of seems silly. In all of my conversations with publication planners, it's really apparent that not only do they understand sort of the structure of trials, probably better than some of the editors do, but they also understand a lot of details about the particular subject matters that they're dealing with. So if they're dealing with a cardiovascular drug, they actually understand, and they understand about the pharmacokinetics of their drug and so on. They actually have a fairly good grasp of these things. These are not fools. Okay. Starting to lead towards wrapping up here. So I think publication planning shows that there's a large number of papers. I didn't make a case for this today, but it's multiply published data that happens. And this is placed to good advantage with prominent authors, more prominent authors on average than comparable publications, even in the same journals. And these are better promoted than comparable papers because they're actually transmitted to doctors' offices, right? What's happened to the standard image of sponsored research? Well, that's all gone. what I'm describing here is one little chunk of what I call assemblage marketing, this little chunk that's going on up here. And you go from a bunch of disparate, unconnected pieces of a drug, essentially, or a drug market, almost the same thing. A drug and a drug market, I think, are actually more or less two sides of the same coin, to a set of tiles that fit much, much better together when it's done properly, right? So the publications, the physicians, the key opinion leaders, the drugs, the trials, all start to fit really, really well together here. This is the story that I tell in larger detail in that book, because I also want to tell the stories of some of these other tiles here and other case studies. The ideal for this, of course, is monopoly, and this is actual swag from an actual pharmaceutical conference, right? You wouldn't believe that they would produce such a thing, but yes. Okay. A question that often gets asked, and I'm just going to preempt it here, so is this real science? And I've already tried to say it's real science. It's not tabloid science, right? And it's not something that just sells but isn't substantial. This is genuine medical science. It has to be, I think. It actually succeeds by being of high quality. The top-tier journals actually they reject a lot of publication, a lot of manuscripts, right? So if you look at a journal like BMJ, that has a rejection rate of 95%. So this work has to be of high quality if it's going to make it into top journals, or even it has to be of high quality if it's going to make it into a mid-ranked journal. And these publications go to a whole range of different journals, because audiences are what the publication planners care about most. They care about the right kinds of connotations of these journals. But that includes the BMJs, the Lancets, the Journal of the American Medical Association, but it also includes ones you've never heard of. It has to be of high quality because I think when we look at the sponsored, like in the study the meta-analysis that I was showing, it turns out that on crude quality indicators, it's pretty similar. In fact, industry often scores better on these crude quality, methodological quality indicators than independent work. Producing quality science is the basis of ethical self-justifications by the writers, the publication planners, and everybody else involved. When I talk with these people, it's clear that they understand themselves as producing science. They don't want to be producing garbage. They want to be producing real science, and they can make a case. They can make cases that, for example, they move data into the public eye faster than independent researchers do. They are more efficient. They can work with authors from around the world better, and so on and so forth. So but they have, at the core, the ethical self-justification has to involve producing real science. And finally, the companies have the resources to do this. They don't have to produce tabloid science. They have the resources to produce good work. Not finally, sorry. One more thing. I think if you look at the scandals that have arisen, there have been scandals. But I think that the number of scandals where we would identify something as fraudulent data, where we actually see fraud on the part of pharmaceutical companies, is quite low. This is because I think we set quite a high bar for fraud, but maybe that's a side point we could talk about afterwards. But I think if we're talking about fraudulent data, it's not that common for the companies. And I think that there's a good reason for that. There are so many checks in this system. Nobody wants to be responsible for having committed a fraud. Like it's nobody in this process. In fact, fraud is more likely, I would say, from the independent researchers, because the independent researchers don't have nearly so many checks, right? They don't have people they're reporting to in all the same ways. So I think what we call fraud is uncommon. But ghost-managed science is choice-laden, like all science. It's choice-laden. And its choices are driven by a really narrow set of interests, commercial interests. Basically, the choices are driven by sales. End of story. Right? So if you imagine that there's a whole sequence of choices in this very, very complicated work of producing, say, a result from a clinical trial, one kind of result, clinical trial results. If you imagine that there's a whole sequence of discrete, obvious choices being made, and if the vast majority of them are pushing in one direction rather than the other, even if they're all defensible choices, you're going to get a certain amount of bias in the end process. This is how I'm imagining that the bias arises anyway, is this continuous choices pushing in one direction. Again, even if they're all defensible, and I think that many of them are. Maybe not all, but many of the choices are defensible. And so we can actually measure the bias in the results. That's been done many times. So many times now that in the collaboration in which I was involved, one of the sentences in the resulting article was, "Please don't do this study ever again." We don't need to do this study ever again. But we might be missing perhaps more important biases in the framing, the questions, and the emphases that are going on here, right? So that we can see the biases in the results, but we can't measure in any sort of clear way biases in these framing questions, et cetera. So I guess another point that I just wanted to mention in passing here is that this work achieves success also by mimicking in close ways the standard structures that we have. It's sort of building off of standard structures of medical research. There's a kind of tight connection between these. So now really getting close to wrapping up here. So I think I've tried to make the case that pharmaceutical companies have this sort of substantial but partly hidden influence on domains of established medical knowledge. You can prefer information. If you prefer to talk in terms of information, I think it's useful to talk in terms of knowledge. And just as we can recognize that there aren't sort of the kind of organized oppositions, so we can see where this particular tug of war is going to go. We might see this as sort of not enough conflict. And then I want to take this back to the political economy of knowledge. So I've presented what a pretty unsubtle and what I said was a pathological case. This is not the kind of thing that we would want to see in a functioning political economy of knowledge. Too much of it is just deriving attempted legitimacy from the mimicking of sort of the building onto established structures, but with completely different goals than the structures are originally set out for. But I think that the approach, what I've tried to illustrate the value of the approach of thinking in terms of political economies of knowledge. That's more generally useful. When we go to investigate a domain, I think we should be mindful of who is creating knowledge for what results, how it, and for what ends, how it accumulates and moves, where it goes, and then we can ask questions about sources of legitimacy and the structures that we would want to see. But I think that all of these questions need to be asked, and that's a useful way of approaching fields in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
For a fascinating story of publication planning, which was news to me, and also, of course, the whole way in which biomedical research is conducted, published, and all this approaches to some great expertise tied up with the pharmaceutical industry. So time is now open for questions. Yes?
Thank you. Extremely interesting talk. And I think that that's fantastic research. And first of all, I would say that in the field of the history and sociology of science, STS in general, social construction of science technology has been fashionable for a while. Nowadays, things became far more complicated, and especially in the field of biomedical sciences, scholars began to pay attention to some unexpected factors. In case of the cosmetic surgery, which is also kind of biomedical intervention in the body, there is a recent work on the history of complaints on cosmetic surgery. A lot of patients have a surgery on their face. They actually found out that the outcome is not as good as they expected, and then they file a complaint. And then this is actually revisionist challenges on the notion that cosmetic surgeons are imposing cultural or racial norms on their customer's face.
Mm-hmm.
But these racial or cultural norms do not always work because body refuses to accept it. Actually, in your case, I think that it's quite very good. It's a great research, but if the medical scientists who actually pass through such a narrow gate of the major medical journals such as The Lancet or DMJ, 5% acceptance rate, they are not fraudulent. But we know that bodies refuse to accept corporate interest.
Mm-hmm.
And it means that there are size of the research participants, patients actually receive the medication from the corporations, and probably at least some of them got some side effect and the complaints and so on. Did you ever do some research on this side?
So, yes. I mean, I think that a certain amount of the evidence that I've presented actually comes from exactly the kinds of problems that sometimes arise. So I started us off, not quite, almost started us off with Jeffrey List presenting the advantage trial of Vioxx, which is a drug that got pulled. That's a drug that may have killed as many as 200,000 people. That's a very substantial number of people. In the book, I describe, I talk about the OxyContin problem in the U.S., which has definitely killed more than 200,000 people. So these are, these are and then the Wyeth case, the hormone replacement therapy case. However, it is often difficult to figure out exactly what's going on in any given case. So the Vioxx case, I say, may have killed as many as 200,000, the drug may have killed as many as 200,000 people. If I talk to older doctors today, I can easily find many who would say Vioxx was basically a good drug. It was overprescribed. It was prescribed to a lot of people who should not have been taking it. And that is the problem. It should never have been withdrawn from availability, but rather should still be available for a niche market. So that's a claim that I have run into repeatedly by older doctors. This was a good drug that went wrong because of overprescription. So now we can see an alternate narrative from the adverse events narrative, which recognizes the adverse events, but says, no, the problem was just overprescription, right? That it was overmarket. It was just pushed far too much. And indeed, it was pushed very, very heavily. So now we have an alternate narrative going on here. And I think in this realm, it's often very difficult to decide which of many, many different narratives one is going to take around a product with potential problems. Efficacy is no better than adverse events, right? So whether a drug has adverse events, whether people reject it because it's making them feel bad or something, is one sort of issue. But efficacy is exactly parallel. Whether the drug works is also a question, and we can often have different kinds of narratives about the efficacy of a product. People often deeply believe in the efficacy of a product that they're taking. And yet one can have alternative narratives. You can talk with a person who's been taking a statin cholesterol-lowering drug for 30 years who might attribute their life to this cholesterol-lowering drug. And then you can look at data which suggests that maybe they should never have been prescribed it in the first place, and that they may be doing, they may have actually shortened their, the data may suggest that they may have shortened their life rather. But from an individual patient's point of view, that taking a drug for a or one of a sequence of drugs for a very, very long period of time they might owe their life to that. They might really feel very, very deeply about that. So these are complicated things. Mostly, one of the reasons they're complicated. I think they're especially complicated when you cannot feel the effects immediately. So actually, in some ways, painkillers are the best kind of drug to evaluate because you kind of know whether they're working really fast or not. For example, that's painkillers, one kind of class of drugs that are easy to evaluate. But with the Vioxx, we can even see that there's problems with there. But most products, you can't feel or see the effects at all. They can only be measured quantitatively over long periods of time, and then we're right back into this process here. Right. So I think it might be a little bit different from cosmetic surgery. Yeah? I'll let you.
Some of these publications that the pharmaceutical field, have you come across like similar sort of activity in other scientific fields, like economics and so on? And the other is, what were your data sources? So you mentioned you went to these like two association convention things, and also you look at court cases for some of these things. But what else?
So I'll start with the last question. The data sources. So in addition to the society meetings and the court cases, I also draw on a small number of interviews, and I draw on documents in which the publication planning agencies advertise themselves, namely on the web. The agencies can be found on the web, and they advertise themselves. They make claims about what they do. Increasingly, they're being very coy about the claims that they do. Like that, it's changed. This has changed a lot in the past decade. A decade ago, you could have looked on the web for one of the many publication planning agencies. There were. I counted. I actually did a little experiment once. Sorry, I'm not answering your question here, but I did a little experiment once because I thought that it might give me a possible in on a publication for a medical journal. I set myself a period of time, I'm forgetting now how much it was, whether it was 3 hours or 4 hours or something like that, and tried to find as many publication planning agencies as I could in that short period of time. And I thought that this would be, this was a quantitative, it was an attempt at a kind of quantitative approach, because medical journals don't like anything that isn't or they prefer to get quantitative approaches. I thought I could do it that way. I could say, here's, it's a race against time. How many can I find? I found 50. Slightly more than 50 publication planning agencies in that short period of time that I was searching the web. That was about a little more than a decade ago, or no, it was less than a decade ago, about a decade ago. Have I seen this kind of thing in other fields? Well, I mentioned the medical device area, so that it exists, and it is entirely duplicated in the medical device area. In other areas, it's much less common. I think it does exist in areas like environmental toxicology. There are people who've done work that shows similar sorts of structures, but to a lesser extent. So looking at pesticides, things like that, for example, you can find similar sorts of work going on around pesticides. I'm forgetting, I had another example, but I've lost it just this moment. But yes, it exists, but to a lesser extent. These are well-developed large structures in medicine, in the pharmaceutical industry, much, much less well-developed in other areas. I'll let.
Yeah, I want to get your opinion. How much of what you say is being affected by two factors? One, from drug discovery to drug approval, especially in the case of US, you're talking about $1 billion a drug. And on top of that, you have a data protection which is beyond that of a patent protection. Mm-hmm. So if you and I were to start a drug industry, we are caught with these two big cost factors and opportunity costs. Mm-hmm. So how would one then address to overcome? So I do not know. Okay, that's my first question. Mm-hmm. And the second question, based on all the research you have done, is there a difference between the in vivo and in vitro type of research? Do they pursue a similar approach or they don't?
Right. Okay. So I think, first of all, I think that the $1 billion figure is a fiction created by the pharmaceutical industry. I think it's a large number, but I don't think we're talking about $1 billion typically. I think it's more in the low 100, sort of be in the 100 to 200 million US dollars to see a drug through to completion, and that the number is inflated dramatically because of marketing. And we can see this in cases where you have non-pharmaceutical actors trying to produce drugs, and admittedly they go for low-hanging fruit, but why don't the big drug companies go for low-hanging fruit? I don't know. Anyway, so it is a big number. Whatever the number is, none of us have it in our pockets. So that is one factor. Rather than the second one, though, I would say a more important factor is that drugs are sold via science. The drugs are sold via science. When you go to your doctor, you expect your doctor to have a kind of scientific basis for prescribing a product, whether they understand that scientific basis or not. And I don't think that, by and large, doctors understand the scientific basis of, but but you expect them to have the scientific, you expect them to be able to refer to so-and-so told me that this happened. And they want to have the recourse to science. The FDA wants to have the recourse to science. These are all different ways. So I think that it's actually very understandable that if you have an industry where it's tricky to evaluate things and everything is sold, with a kind of scientific promise, then the science is going to become co-opted fairly quickly. I think I just would say that's.
How about the data protection bit, which is actually appear with the latest US-Mexico deal as well as the US-Canadian deal, the trade deal. Both actually agree to extend, especially for the biologic drugs. The other one, I think, is about 8 years now. We are talking about beyond 8 years.
I think we might have other reasons for caring about data, the long periods of data protection, and I think that but I don't think that my story is really primarily about the data.
I mean, this would somewhat influence the behavior of a business.
Yep. Oh, I see.
You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
These two factors are the driving force. So unless you pass law or some sort of behavior to remove this, then otherwise you're not going to disrupt this. You're going to go on. Especially where data protection period get longer.
Right. So drug companies are very secretive about their data, even to their authors. Typically, they don't like their authors to see anything that looks like raw data. They have recently made a commitment that authors should have some access to raw data, but rarely complete access to raw data. So they're very, very sticky about the raw data. They do, though, want to present analyzed data of the kind that I'm talking about. They want the analyzed data out there as much as possible. So there's a kind of difference going on there. Turning to your second question about in vitro, in vivo, yeah, I think that there are differences there. There are pretty big differences. Clinical research is what people care about most. So the in vitro stuff is not really part of the selling process nearly to the extent that the in vivo, in human part is part of the selling process. Because clinical results count for practical purposes in doctors' minds. They don't want to be working out what are the chemical pathways going on, and that's a much more complicated situation. What you want is a statistical analysis that says, in this comparison trial, these people did better than these people. End of story. So yeah, I think that the in vitro is a completely different world.
That's a question.
Hi.
So I was wondering about whether the pharmaceutical companies care or are interested in preserving trust between doctors who prescribe their drugs and patients, because it seemed like in many ways through the the production of science, which it gives it its legitimacy, and the end person who is supposed to be targeted here is the physician, the doctor,
Right.
But now with I guess this is maybe largely an American phenomenon, but I've heard about it in other parts of the world, the anti-vaxxers and things like that, have their trust in physicians and pharmaceutical companies who they think have co-opted doctors has eroded. So if the physician overprescribes, it's the physician's fault for overprescribing, but actually pharmaceutical companies want them to prescribe lots of their drugs. So, but the responsibility lays with the physician to know when and how to use these drugs, which, as you said, they often don't have this knowledge. So, do these pharmaceutical companies care about the crisis of trust between patients and doctors? And you kind of mentioned one court case around, I think, Vioxx, is it?
Oh, the HRT, yeah. Renewing confidence around HRT, yeah. That's a good question that I don't know I have a nice answer to. I haven't seen any indication that pharmaceutical companies are thinking in these terms. I haven't seen any indication. That doesn't mean that there isn't any, that there isn't out there some sort of conversation going on in the companies about an impending crisis or something like that. Let me tell you a related story, but not quite on your question. There's a perennial problem of adherence, or compliance in the old terms. People don't take their drugs. It's actually a well-known phenomenon. It's been stable for at least as long as the pharmaceutical industry has been studying it, which is at least I would say 40 years. Numbers are stable. There is approximately it's a 1/3 drop-off across many, many classes of drugs between prescription and filling the prescription. So there's a 1/3 drop, 1/3 of patients don't fill the prescription. Then there's a 1/3 drop-off of people who fill the prescription but don't refill it, let's say 2 weeks later or a month later, whenever is the standard period, and so on and so forth. You keep going. Drug companies care a lot about adherence because, of course, that's sales in the end, right? So they've devoted a lot of attention to that. Not a particular crisis recently, but a kind of perennial problem. And they've developed many, many techniques for increasing adherence. At the same time, as sales increase, you can increase adherence, and it's a bit like the Red Queen. You have to run as fast as you can to stay in the same place, right? So you keep increasing sales, and then you have exactly the same figures of adherence problems, even though you have nice techniques for increasing patient adherence. So it's a kind of interesting conundrum, but they devote a lot of attention to that. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. Fascinating. Talking about political economy, basically we talk about what you mentioned in your slide, bias and interest, and STS has been doing a great job in unpacking bias and interest in scientific disciplines. But what struck me in your discovery of this particular practice of scientific publication is that you mentioned that, well, this is real science, right? This is real science, and it seems that the whole structure of this publication industry are self-controlled, so that they don't really, so they are able to maintain the quality of the publications. But when we talk about political economy, there's always externalities. So I was wondering whether in your research you have indicated potential productions of externalities that may not be occurring now, but I don't know, in the long term,
Mm-hmm.
be something. It may become something that will, come back and become sort of a source for the vulnerability of this practice.
I think that's a good question, and I think that there are externalities that play a role, and the companies are, they do their best to manage those, to deal with or manage the externalities. Here's one example of an externality that had some potential to disrupt the particular, the publication planning story that I told. In the U.S., the Sunshine Act, which required companies to report how much they were paying to physicians, was initially thought to require that the companies would have to report a value figure for authorship on a paper. And the value of the authorship on the paper was deemed to be quite large. And so there was a worry among publication planners that when they made somebody an author on the paper, they were going to have to count that as $10,000 or $15,000 of payment to the author. They thought, well, many authors may really object to having a database that's saying that they were paid $10,000 or $15,000 when they receive no cash, right? Doctors don't mind that. It turned out that doctors didn't mind so much having the database available if they were actually paid the cash. But if they weren't paid the cash, then so this was a fear among publication planners. And I remember hearing sort of long conversations, what are we going to do about this problem, before the Sunshine Act actually kicked into effect. In the end, it was decided by the community that this was not actually a reportable amount. So, but it stood a chance to seriously disrupt the fact. And that's just sort of a kind of contingent little external factor of a kind of transparency, not even the regular, sort of an odd sort of transparency given the hidden aspects of what I'm talking about. But yeah, so.
I just wondered if you could have a more benign interpretation. So the drug companies have lots of candidate drugs.
Yeah.
And they have their in-house statisticians and people doing clinical trials. So the so-called authors actually seem to be functioning as reviewers. And there's the constraint that the in-house statistician, in the end, this has to be something that will pass the scrutiny of a prominent scientist in the field. So maybe in that way, it actually is a public good. It's a little embarrassing the way it's structured, but they must reject lots of drugs, right? I mean, that publication chain must seldom go, I don't know how you know that, but I mean, how many times does it actually go to the end? How many trials do they make before they find one that they will actually sell?
So we know these figures for clinical trials, and I forget them off. I don't have them on the top of my head, but these are for the phased clinical trials, there are drop-offs at every step, and what makes it past phase 1 clinical trial is not likely to make it to the end of a phase 3 clinical trial. So anyway, these are and the drop-offs are significant. You're right that this is going on. I go back to there being no evidence that authors make any comments or contributions to the paper. As far as I can see, the authors are doing very, very little of that kind of review function, right? So they serve. I remember when I was in graduate school, somebody said, I always read papers, by Robert May, the evolutionary biologist, because although I know that he hasn't written them or done the research, at least his name is on the paper because, and that's a good kind of indication. His graduate students are good graduate students, and this is likely to be a good paper. Maybe there's an element of that, but I don't see any evidence of it. I agree that there's a lot of the companies are losing a lot of drugs along the way, right? Drug discovery is a very, very sort of risky process, and the companies realize that it's a risky process. I'm not sure what the implications are of that. So. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm wondering how universities may come into this
Mhm.
picture.
Mm-hmm.
Increasingly, universities are working with these companies
Mm-hmm.
and industries generally. We have, corporate labs, industrial labs, and all the rest of it. So, in a sense, we're going beyond just individual authors putting their names on a paper, but
Mhm.
you have big institutions like universities, publicly funded and everything, working in close collaboration.
Right. That's a good question too, and I don't have nice neat answers to a nice neat answer to that sort of observation. I can say that we didn't even need to have close collaborations with the companies in order for universities to generally step in on behalf of their faculty members whenever a scandal was arising. So when it has been exposed that somebody may have put their name on an article, and typically it's an article where there's a deep problem somewhere along the way, the university in question has usually risen to support the faculty member in question rather than to challenge the faculty member in question. And there are reasons for that. I mean, these tend to be more sort of among the prominent faculty members, and so universities don't want to lose them. They don't want to alienate them, so they tend to support the faculty members rather than to say that this is a scandal that somebody needs to. So at the most, there's a kind of wrapping on the wrist that happens, and that's without the sort of deep connections that you're talking about. I think you're right that we're increasingly entering a new world, though, where especially in the sort of the biotech world rather than the big pharma world. Big pharma is so much bigger than universities that they like the research, but they prefer that academics do the risky research on their own time with public funding and that sort of thing. And they just take, here's a receptor. Here's a receptor that's of real interest. Now let's find a substance that attaches to this receptor, right? So they prefer that. But the biotech companies, which are not part of the story, or not typically part of the stories that I'm talking about, are engaging deeply with universities at different sorts of levels. And I think that there are going to be many cases in which you have a kind of lack of distinction in the end between where the sort of lack of boundaries between the end of the biotech company and the end of the university. These things become neatly fused. So, yeah.
Okay. So, any last question? If not, I think lunch we are being served outside. And on that happy note, let's thank our speaker once again.
Thank you very much.